Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about life in a medieval village. This episode, Working the Land, will focus on how Europe, then a continent of hamlets, provided all the necessities of life by working in the fields. The peasants worked all year long, all 4 seasons, to provide enough food for themselves and their families and their communities. And each village at the end of the year would face either feast or famine. Europe was a thinly populated place compared to today. Even at its peak, medieval Europe was home to no more than 90 million people, about 1/10 its modern population. One could travel for days without seeing any sign of human habitation. As late as 1500, at least 80% of Europe still lived in peasant villages. Few of these villages were home to more than 100 people. Back then, the average man stood a little over 5 feet tall, with his wife often a little shorter. Anyone more than 6 feet tall was considered a giant, inspiring legends like Jack the Giant Killer. Most villages consisted of a muddy lane surrounded by wattle and daub huts, often made from a timber frame of woven twigs and sticks, then plastered over with a dried mixture of mud, straw, and animal feces. Many peasant cottages had dirt floors with straw pallets and rough woolen blankets for bedding. All members of the family slept together. Of course, the families only lived in a fenced-off part of the house, with the rest reserved for pigs, chickens, and geese. If that sounds uncomfortable, peasants spent very little time in their houses. Almost every day of the year was devoted to raising enough food to avoid starvation. Peasant villages strove to be self-contained, producing everything they needed, in part because outside trade was rare until the 1100s. Geese and chickens wandered freely through the village, as the peasants kept them for their eggs. Sheep and goats grazed the common meadow outside the village, kept for milk and wool. Woolen clothes might be dyed with fruit or vegetable juice if available. Since peasants only had woolen clothes, warm for the winter but too hot during the summer, some peasants simply disrobed and worked unclothed throughout the summer. Now, no one in the village actually owned anything. The lord of the manor owned the mill, the pastures, and the fields. Of course, the lord of the manor was a distant figure, often away at war. The peasants, however, did face the lord's appointed officials, like reeves who ran the village and bailiffs who ran the court. Peasants only had use of anything in the village as long as they paid the lord feudal dues. For the miller, that meant paying the lord for the right to run the mill. For the common peasant, that meant spending 40 to 50 days a year working the lord's land, while their wives and children worked the fields that fed their families. In busy times, even pregnant women and small children worked the fields. Now, these fields were actually strips of land called furlongs that surrounded the village. Village courts often gave families good and bad furlongs based on how many members they had, which gave couples an incentive to have more children. One of the main tasks of village courts was making sure that peasants weren't plowing over their allotted strip, looking for telltale pieces of turf that gave away the culprits. Those found plowing outside their furlongs could expect hefty fines. So what did the peasants grow in these furlongs? Potatoes and carrots were yet to come to Europe, so the peasants mainly grew turnips, parsnips, beans, and peas. During the early Middle Ages, peasants ate more vegetable soups than bread. Indeed, peasants even had instant vegetable soup or pottage made of dried peas that could be liquefied in some beer to make a hearty drink. However, when the medieval warm period began in the year 1000, peasants were able to grow more wheat and barley. This meant a lot more bread on peasant tables and a lot more beer in peasant jugs, often because the water wasn't very drinkable. Since hops only became available in the 1400s, local herbs and honey had to do for flavoring, both for beer and food. Berries and nuts might appear in peasant diets if available, along with apples and pears when in season. However, fruit and flavors were at most a sideline. After all, it took enough work to grow the grain and vegetables which were the staff of life. With only the simplest tools, everything had to be done by hand, and despite a year of back-breaking labor, the medieval peasant only produced 1/5 of what a modern farmer can do with the same amount of land. Of course, a modern farmer has the advantage of tractors and combines, while the peasant had to do everything by hand, and work consumed their entire year. Springtime meant planting. As soon as late winter, the peasants began planting vegetables in their gardens and tended fruit trees if the village included an apple or pear orchard. Of course, the great task of spring was plowing. Few peasant families could afford a plow or the oxen to pull it. Indeed, there was often only one plowshare in the village. It belonged to the lord of the manor and was often locked up in the church. If a peasant wanted it, they had to rent both the plowshare and a team of oxen to pull it. Village families might make a pool to rent the plow and the oxen, then take turns using it to plow their furlongs. To fertilize the fields, peasants also worked together to collect horse, oxen, pig, and human droppings throughout the year to lay in the fields to create compost. That is the reason that all crops had to be boiled before eating, and it's worth remembering that many peasant women and children had to work barefoot. While summer brought an end to the planting, it was also a dangerous time. A single downpour during the warm season could all but destroy a crop. On the other hand, too much sun or not enough soil moisture meant a meager harvest. Worst of all, a late spring frost might destroy recently planted seeds, so all energy went towards preserving the crop. Children as young as 3 years old roamed the fields with bells and sticks to scare birds out of the crops before they ate the seeds. Meanwhile, their parents and older siblings found full-time work weeding the crops by hand. Even short weeds took water and soil nutrients from the crops, but weeds that grew taller than the crops would destroy the harvest by depriving it of sunlight. Medieval Europe had not one, but 2 harvests. First, the hay harvest in June, then the peasants got to work the wheat harvest during August and September. Men, women, and children worked together, bringing in the crops. Wheat had to be cut with a scythe, and then the grains beaten out with a flail. Wheat heads had to be separated from the chaff with a sieve, shaken from side to side in a strong wind. If there was no wind, another person made one by waving a sheet. Women tied the wheat into sheaves to dry in the sun before they moved it to a barn. Carts of wheat being taken to the barns were often stacked so high that the carts could easily tip over. Once the peasants finally finished with the harvest, the lord of the manor provided the peasants with a feast of food and drink to thank them for their hard work, and this feast became the center of Europe's harvest festivals. In November, the peasants butchered some of their animals, salting or smoking the meat to ensure they wouldn't rot during the cold months. During wintertime, the peasants finally had time to tend to their own houses. Severe weather and strong winds could often damage peasant houses. However, because of the many tasks that needed to be done throughout the year, houses might have straw stuffed into their holes until winter. Then the peasants could use wood and twigs to make repairs to the walls, weaving them together to make the house as strong as they could. However, holes in the thatched straw roof would have to wait until spring, as straw could rarely be found during the winter. During this time, peasants also pruned the apple and pear trees in the orchard, cutting away some of the branches to help the fruit get more sun and space. Today we worry about money. In the Middle Ages, people worried about food. The reward for a year of toil was a table groaning with food. If the harvest was bountiful, peasants gorged themselves on huge rolls of black bread, heavy with bran. Thick vegetable soups called pottage, made from cabbage, watercress, dried peas, and even bacon. And if they butchered an animal, the peasants also ate huge pork sausages. However, not every year could be bountiful. For every 3 years with middling to good harvests, peasants could expect to endure 1 year of famine. Peasants facing both the need to feed themselves through the winter while saving up seed corn for the next planting might be forced to sell everything. Animals, furniture, even the clothes off their backs. Travelers told of whole families and villages reduced to nudity during famine. To survive, peasants were reduced to eating bark off the trees, roots, grass, and even digging up the earth to eat white clay for breakfast. In the hardest years, most notably the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, some villages even waylaid travelers, murdering them to eat their flesh. Some stories even told of desperate peasants digging up fresh graves or ripping bodies off the gallows to eat warm flesh raw, if need be. Small wonder that people were willing to work so hard throughout the entire year. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.